So glad you're back with us for another Gold Nugget segment. Today's special guest, G. Edward Griffin, author of The Creature from Jekyll Island. Well, in 1910, a group of financiers and their representatives met at Jekyll Island off of the Georgia coast. The meeting was so secret the participants only used first names. As the Federal Reserve approaches its 100th birthday, the author of The Creature from Jekyll Island, G. Edward Griffin, joins me to discuss the implications of the Fed's policies. Welcome back, sir.
Well, thank you. Good to be here.
I'd like to focus this dialogue around refitting the creature from Jekyll Island to the current state of affairs. But before we dive into QE1 and 2, let's review the predatory nature of the Federal Reserve. Few people realize that the Fed is owned by private interests, many of whom are outside our national borders. The Fed's owners are not concerned with the sovereignty of our 300 million Americans. Instead, profit is their primary objective. Now, we're not here to put capitalism on trial. However, when it comes to the national money supply caretakers, sovereignty, I think, is of the utmost significance.
Yes, I think you're quite right. Sovereignty is very, very important for many reasons, but your comment about not putting capitalism on trial, I think, needs to be addressed. We're not dealing with capitalism here. Capitalism has been dead in America for quite a few decades. It exists only in name only. What we have in the United States for quite a while now is a collectivist form of system. It's not much different than some of the totalitarian systems we fought wars against, except little by little, bit by bit, one piece of legislation after another, to finally, what we have in America is not capitalism. It's much closer to the Karl Marx model of socialism or communism. It's not a lot different from fascism. All of those different isms really are quite similar to each other, and we're it. So when you say the system is failing in America today, it's not the capitalist system failing. It's the socialist system or the collectivist model that's failing. I think it's extremely important to keep that in mind because we're still using the old words and applying them to the new reality, and they just don't fit too well. The Federal Reserve System is part of that milieu. It's necessary to understand that the banks that make up the Federal Reserve cartel, which is basically what it is. It's not a government agency, as you said. The banks that own the Federal Reserve are a cartel, and it's true that they do have links to banking interests in other countries. But as far as the Federal Reserve itself is concerned, it's an American institution. And technically it's owned by the member banks. But the ownership that comes with holding those little tiny bits of stock in the Federal Reserve doesn't carry the usual prerogative of ownership. If you own something, you can sell it, can't you? Well, nobody in the Federal Reserve System can sell their shares. It's necessary for them to hang on to them. If you own shares in a corporation, you can vote those shares to determine who leads it. The ones who hold the shares in the Federal Reserve System cannot vote their shares. They don't determine who leads it. It's all determined, politically. The local units of the Federal Reserve can't even set their own policies. It all comes from New York and so forth. The ownership of the Fed is kind of it's a non-issue. Who owns it? The real issue is who controls it. It's quite often true in the world today that control is more important than ownership. Sometimes people can control great fortunes without owning them, such as, the Ford Foundation, the Rockefeller Foundation, the Carnegie Foundation. These tax-exempt foundations, the fortunes of the donors technically are not owned by the donors anymore. They're public corporations, supposedly. But who controls those corporations? Who selects the people that sit on the board of directors that make the decisions? If you really want to dig into that, you find that, they're selected by the families that donated the money. Usually they're people that work for them in various forms or another. And so indirectly they control their fortunes just as though they own them, but they technically do not own them. It's important to keep that in mind because in the Federal Reserve System we have a similar relationship. It's not who owns the Fed, it's who controls the Fed, who directs the Fed. And that comes right back to the major banks in New York, the larger banks in New York. So now we come finally all around this to the question about sovereignty. I think that sovereignty is extremely important in the world today. It's not an outdated concept at all. It's important because we want to be the masters of our own ship. We want to determine where our ship is sailing and how fast it goes and when it gets there, what path it takes. So we don't want the affairs of this nation being determined by politicians from other countries, for example. And that's, of course, where we're headed. And when we see this new world order, as they like to describe it, growing up around us, this internationalism, the one world government headquartered at the United Nations, built on the collectivist model, is growing daily. And each time it grows, another brick on the wall, our sovereignty is lost, one more brick. So the goal is to merge the United States into an internationalist order where the people of America don't even determine the policies within their own countries anymore. Now, what's that got to do with the Federal Reserve? It's got a lot to do with it because the Federal Reserve banking cartel is very much internationalist in concept and orientation, and certainly in goal. They want the people who run the Federal Reserve, the money masters, as some people call them, are internationalists in their thinking, and they're on record long ago as having said the best thing for America is to surrender its sovereignty, or to have its sovereignty not surrendered but taken from them bit by bit, whether the people want it or not, whether they know it or not. So they're pushing us into internationalism, and one of the steps that we can look for to make this very visible is the abandonment of the American dollar, to get rid of the American dollar and replace it probably first by a regional monetary unit that they intend to call it the Amero, which would be similar to the euro in Europe. The euro in Europe is a currency used by all the member nations of the European Union. Well, in America, their plan definitely now is to create a North American Union, and they want to include Mexico, the United States, and Canada in a regional government, and it will have its regional money supply, the Amero, and then eventually down the line, who knows how long, but possibly 20 years later or 18 years later, even those currencies will be merged into a central one world currency. This is their plan. They make no mistakes about it. They don't hide it. They discuss it openly. They say, won't it be wonderful when that comes to be? So now the final answer is yes, the Federal Reserve System is an instrument of internationalism. It's an attack against our sovereignty, and that's one of the many things that is wrong with it.
Well, it's very elaborately said. I think it's a good segue into my next question. And, up until the credit crisis of 2000,